Oxford Road, Manchester, centre of one of the largest academic complexes in Britain. At one end of the road is the Polytechnic. The Student Union is named after the South African leader, Nelson Mandela. At the other end of Oxford Road, the University Union is also named after a black South African, Steve Biko.
Free Nelson Mandela.
The student unions of Manchester commemorate the names of two of the main opponents of apartheid in South Africa. Their struggle was a costly one. For Mandela, it was to lead to a quarter of a century in prison. For Biko, it meant an early death at the age of 30. Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964. The long campaign for his release captured the attention of people everywhere. In 1984, a song about him even reached number 9 in the British charts. In Britain, parks, streets and housing estates were named after him. But who is he, and why did he become such a household name around the world? Nelson Mandela was born in 1918 into the royal family of the Tembu tribe in the Transkei. He studied law and set up in practice with Oliver Tambo.
There was a lot of prejudice against us. You know, the magistrates were white, the prosecutors were white, the police were white. And most of the time, practically all the time, of course, we appeared for blacks.
In 1944, Mandela joined the African National Congress Party and with Oliver Tambo founded the youth section. The campaign began of active resistance to apartheid.
Now, that system, of course, is based on the theory that the black man is inferior and must accept inferiority, must accept his place in life, and that place is the place of a subhuman. Now, Nelson Mandela is like many who would never accept that. And as an individual, he fought this anyway, even in his private life. So he would fight it if he found it affecting an entire population. So that brought him into politics.
Apartheid is an Afrikaans word which literally means apartness. The South African government introduced it in 1948 to preserve their Afrikaans heritage of language and of culture. The 1948 government quickly introduced laws leading to segregation and discrimination. People were divided into rigid racial categories: white, coloured, Asian or African. Marriages between whites and other groups were forbidden by law. Segregation was to be found in every aspect of life. The driving force in the new policy was the Minister for Native Affairs, Hendrik Verwoerd.
Verwoerd did not distinguish only between white and black. It was white, non-white in his whole thinking. In other words, basically racism. Now, if you look at everything that he applied, for example, the fact that all lifts in public buildings in Africa were segregated. One lift for whites, one for non-whites. All the public counters in the post office, everything, segregated. All the entrances to public buildings, whites, non-whites. The benches in the public parks, marked, whites, non-whites. Taxis, whites, non-whites. A non-white taxi was not even allowed to convey the luggage of a white person.
In the 1950s, Mandela and his friends organised defiance of the apartheid law. Trevor Huddleston was then a young missionary in Johannesburg.
The purpose of the Defiance campaign was simply to protest against the immediate pressures of apartheid, the past laws, segregation in transport, the difference in education structures, everything, in fact, that we now understand as being the essence of apartheid. And the way they did it, of course, was by defying those laws, sitting on benches reserved for whites, going through doors into railway stations and post offices which said ni blancas or blancas, non-whites or whites, defying in that way and so drawing attention to the basic injustice of apartheid.
The government acted swiftly. Mandela was one of 47 people convicted of organising the defiance campaign. He was given a 9-month suspended sentence. The next stage of the campaign was a survey of opinion throughout the country. Mandela was one of the organisers. Out of this survey came a new manifesto, a Freedom Charter.
We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people.
The Freedom Charter included
A vote for everyone, equal rights, nationalisation of the country's national wealth, land reforms so that everyone had at least the right to own the land they worked.
The adoption of the Freedom Charter was absolute anathema. Who are these people to prescribe what sort of state we are going to have in the future? And they were convinced that they would get a conviction of treason of anyone or of everyone who had anything to do with the Congress of the People or the adoption of the Freedom Charter.
In December 1956, 156 Congress leaders, including Nelson Mandela, were arrested by the police. All were charged with treason. The resulting trial was to last for 4 years, but ended in humiliation for the South African government. They failed to get a single conviction against any of the 156 defendants. But then came a major turning point in South African history and in Mandela's own life. March 21, 1960, was the first day of a campaign of civil disobedience against the most detested feature of apartheid, the pass laws. These laws required that all Africans must carry identity cards. The police opened fire on the demonstrators in the black township of Sharpeville in the Transvaal. 69 were killed and 162 wounded.
Sharpeville was one traumatic incident in a whole series of violent things that had been happening, organised by the state against the independence movement. It was perhaps the most dramatic because so many people were killed, but it wasn't unique. And so it had a very marked effect on the thinking of everybody in assisting them to come to the conclusion that violence was inevitable in the political struggle, that it could no longer be delayed.
The South African authorities responded by cracking down on all political opposition. The African National Congress was outlawed, and the government imposed a nationwide state of emergency. South Africa was declared a republic and left the British Commonwealth. Nelson Mandela went into hiding and organised a wave of strikes, or stay-at-homes as they were called. In 1961, he gave a rare interview.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay-at-home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
So the decision was taken to replace peaceful resistance to apartheid by more violent methods. In 1961, African National Congress guerrillas began sabotaging key economic installations such as power pylons. The attacks were carefully designed to avoid taking life. But in 1962, Mandela was arrested and charged with sabotage. He and 7 other African National Congress leaders faced the death penalty for endangering state security. They were also accused of furthering the aims of communism. Mandela pleaded not guilty. He opened the defence with an historic speech attacking apartheid and justifying his own actions.
I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation that had arisen after many years of tyranny, exploitation and oppression of my people by the whites. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The effect was absolutely electric in the court. I mean, there was that sort of hushed silence in which you had the feeling everybody had stopped breathing. Because I think everybody recognised that, in a way, this was a man taking his life in his hands and saying, here, shoot me if you want to. And it really had a completely electric effect on the court, and there was dead silence as he sat down for quite a long time. And then, of course, the excitement broke and the public all started talking and so on, and there was some pandemonium. But for the moment, it was really one of the most dramatic moments I've ever experienced in my life.
Mandela escaped the death sentence, but he was given life imprisonment. He was sent to Robben Island, 6 miles off Cape Town. He was to remain in jail for the next 27 years. The apartheid campaign seemed to have failed. 13 years after Nelson Mandela's trial on September the 25th, 1977, one of the largest funerals ever seen in South Africa, 20,000 people from all over the country came to mourn the death of Steve Biko. Only 30 years old, Biko had been regarded as the heir apparent to Nelson Mandela, but he died mysteriously in police custody.
There may be many reasons given as the cause for his death. Some may have said that he might have died from cerebral contusion. There are others who say that he died from hunger. And I say he died from hunger, but the type of hunger he died from was the type of hunger which leads to free people from their bondage.
Steve Biko was to be the most articulate black nationalist to emerge in the 70s after the imprisonment of Mandela. He was born in King Williamstown, a segregated provincial South African town. The whites live comfortably in pleasant suburban streets. The blacks live outside in shanty towns. He studied medicine at the University of Durban Woodville and formed the first Black Students' Union. One man who knew him well at this time was Sir Robert Burley, the former headmaster of Eton.
Yes, I was out in South Africa, I think it was in 1970. I'd been asked by the students at the English University at Durban to give a lecture on academic freedom, and after it, two of them took me along to the students, the African students' hostel for the medical school. And I'd never heard of him before that, and I don't suppose many people had at that time. And I found him one of the most interesting young men I've ever met in my life, straight away. And had an astonishing conversation with him, which at once convinced me that here was somebody who was going to mean something. He said to me, mind you, there's got to be a white contribution too. We're not the only people in this country. And I thought, when I heard that, I thought, no, that's one of the most encouraging remarks I've heard. And I must say, it didn't surprise me altogether to find that he came from an African.
Nowhere was Biko's influence felt more than in the new movement of black consciousness, the pride in being black. In 1972, Steve Biko was one of the founders of the Black People's Convention, a movement dedicated to the overthrow of apartheid by non-violent means. The editor of a leading South African newspaper, Donald Woods, was a close friend of Steve Biko.
Well, he was the special hero of the young black South African political activists. He articulated their philosophy for them. He was the founder of 4 movements which had a special bearing on their problems. And he was the, you might say, the spiritual head of them all and the advisor and guide of these movements. So he occupied a very special place. At the age of 30, he was just young enough to be acknowledged as the leader of the youth and just mature enough to be able to do so wisely.
But as black consciousness gathered strength, police prosecutions increased. Biko was detained 4 times, once for 100 days, but he was never convicted of any crime. In June 1976, the struggle against apartheid again flared up in violence. The riot was set off by a directive from the Transvaal Education Authority, insisting that both the Afrikaans and English language must be used equally in the black secondary schools. But Afrikaans was seen by the blacks as the language of apartheid, the language of the pass laws and of the police. 3 days of rioting in Soweto left 100 dead and more than 1,000 injured. It was the worst outbreak of racial unrest ever seen in South Africa. Police pressure against black leaders was stepped up. On August 18th, Biko was stopped at a roadblock. The next day, he was taken to a police station near Port Elizabeth. He died a month later while still in custody. On September 25th, 20,000 South Africans attended the funeral. The government announced that Biko had died after a week-long hunger strike. The announcement was greeted internationally with shock and anger. The Anglican funeral turned into one of the biggest political rallies ever seen in South Africa. It lasted for 5 hours.
I wish to bring you the words of the man who has been murdered. And tell me if this man was a terrorist or a man of peace or a man of truth. Steve Biko said, "No race possesses the monopoly of beauty, intelligence, force, and there is room for all of us at the rendezvous of victory."
But perhaps the most remarkable tribute to Steve Biko's short life came from Andrew Young, America's ambassador to the United Nations.
No nation can afford to lose its most dedicated and creative leadership and yet prosper. I know personally how much the United States suffered nationally as a result of the similarly tragic deaths of President John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Senator Robert Kennedy. Certainly, a future non-racial South Africa will mourn the loss of a dedicated native son, Mr. Biko.
13 years later, in February 1990, the world's most famous political prisoner was finally released, as ITN reported.
This was the moment the world paused to applaud, the day the myth yielded to the man and Nelson Mandela walked to freedom. His steps were firm, his gait measured and deliberate, betraying only the hesitation that comes of a man thrust into the spotlight again after 27 years.
President de Klerk had lifted the 30-year-old ban on the African National Congress and freed political prisoners. It was the end of a long chapter in South African history, he said.
A few steps more, a gesture of solidarity and a friendly wave, and Nelson Mandela was about to set out again on the next installment of his political odyssey.
American President George Bush was to describe Mandela's release as another significant step on the road to a non-racial democratic South Africa, which he said all men desire.